Yeah, this is the fifth of five sessions on the book of James here on April 4th. Thanks for sticking with all five. Those of you who've been here every week or who've caught up on video. James is a distinctive book, obviously, in the New Testament. It's not every book is quite like it. Not every book is as stark as James, and not every book is as focused on imperatives or commands and really sometimes some stringent instructions about how to live. And chapter 5 is no exception to all of that. So we'll dig into this. It's in some ways a hard chapter. In some ways, it also brings the book to a really, I think, meaningful or useful conclusion as well. So I'm just going to put in the chat a link to a document that has the full text of James chapter 5, if you want to follow along and see all of the chapter at once on a different window on your computer, you're welcome to do that. And that the document that I put the link to also has the discussion questions. So if you're somebody who cuts out early, at least you have the questions to think about. So we'll jump right in, and I'll do my usual and share a screen here, which can put some text in front of us and give you something else to look at besides just me. The place I want to begin is just with some reflection on how do we get here? How do we get to James chapter 5? What's been going on, and how does this chapter fit into the rest of the book? So. Good question. How did we get here? Well, 4 weeks ago, we talked about the opening lines of the book. And I just want to remind us of a couple of things, that it's addressed to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, or the 12 dispersed tribes, or the 12 tribes in the diaspora. This is language that gets used to describe Judaism as it scattered after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple. Well, first the fall of the northern kingdom, the country of Israel, and later on Judah, and then it's also used to describe the spread of Judaism in the first century, where you've got more Jews living outside of Israel or Palestine than are living inside of it. And so now here we have a Christian book that appears to have a lot of Jewish influence. So it's written to probably Jewish people who are following Jesus as Messiah. We could call them Jewish Christians, although that term's a little bit anachronistic, but nevertheless, it's using these old kind of Jewish ideas of 12 tribes and a dispersed identity. In other words, it's writing to people who have a kind of refugee status, maybe not legally or maybe not literally, but culturally, perhaps they are refugees of sorts. In other words, the book of James addresses itself to believers. And it identifies them as dispersed people, as migrants, perhaps living in a land that might be eager to snatch them up and assimilate them into its own behavior. Maybe a land that wants to make them complicit in its own excesses or its own sins or its own injustices. Maybe the author sees this land or this culture as a place that will reward the church's hypocrisy with things like influence and great wealth. Maybe it's a culture that wants to lure the church into taking its future into its own hands by imagining that it can, plan its way into the future or control its surroundings. And so the author of James, in many ways, is calling these believers to remain alienated or to remain strange in some ways. It's kind of a keep the church strange sort of a book. In that it really wants the readers, the book wants its readers to hold on to certain values and to resist the influences that are around them. And this is 2,000 years ago. Life has changed, culture has changed. But I think if we're going to read the book with its own integrity as an ancient book, we want to keep that in mind, and as well the deep concern that the author of James has. Then the author goes on, greetings, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Those words, trials and testing, are the same essentially in Greek. James is writing to a community that might not be necessarily experiencing oppression or might not be under threat, but might be struggling in some ways, perhaps struggling to live out its values, or struggling to know who it is, or struggling to figure out what its priorities should be. So just to keep that in mind as we get to chapter 5, which has some severe language, that there's a lot of worry woven through this book. And not all worry is bad worry, right? It could be some real concern about a church perhaps losing its way. As well, how did we get here? Beyond those opening verses, well, there's been a lot of concern voiced in the book. So just to go through a couple of slides here with some bullet points to remind you of where we've been. Chapter 1, the book insists that pure religion isn't primarily about pondering sacred ideas or strengthening institutions. This is not a book that speaks about theology as stuff to memorize or lofty ideas about God. It's much more about practices. It's much more about a church in action. And one of the things that James highlights is about the importance of caring for people in distress in chapter 1. In chapter 2, the book warns believers against pandering to the wealthy and to side with those who might manipulate policies and legal systems to their advantage. There's a reference to the courts and being sued. There's concern about offering places of honor to wealthy or influential people and expecting the poor to find their own place when the community gathers. And so James is really worried that the church is going to mirror certain Roman preoccupations with things like honor and status. James is going to did remind us in chapter 2 that God has chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom. James is one of these biblical books that is really not shy about speaking of God having a preference or a kind of focused attention to those who suffer from poverty, and speaks pretty plainly about that, in some ways similar to what Jesus says in maybe the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel. In chapter 3, James has denounced partiality and selfish ambition. We've talked a bit about that, about this kind of desire to get ahead or to kind of outdo your neighbor by viewing much of life as a competition. And then also in chapter 3, James talks about hypocrisy, sees hypocrisy as really a betrayal of your own identity. When the book talks about that a spring can't produce both fresh and polluted water. Talked about one of the things this book despises is double-mindedness, that you can't say you're one thing and act in a different way. Now, we know that life's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's one of the things that James tries to insist upon, is that you're going to act out who or what you really are. Chapter 4, James says you're either a friend of the world or a friend of God. That's one of these binaries or these dualisms in James, that contrast. And also James condemns the church's desire to adopt a competitive or zero-sum practices of what it calls the world. By zero-sum there, I just simply means that every time there's a winner, there has to be a loser, or I can't gain honor or blessing without somebody else losing it. That kind of a mindset of limited resources, or of limited good, or even limited honor or limited blessing in the world. James is harsh about toward people who it describes as being overly ambitious or exhibiting envy. And then we'll see in the beginning of chapter 5 that James is going to criticize people who disrespect and cheat laborers who toil for them in chapter 5. So this is a book that's really concerned with social ethics. I've mentioned this is a book that's been really important in a lot of kind of liberationist movements where especially people in poverty have tried to push the church to be much more concerned about the plight of people in the world today, as opposed to being heavenly minded or only concerned about an afterlife. Hopefully you've seen some of that. So this is all in the air as we get to James chapter 5. I've also talked about this. This is a slide I've put up in the past, that the author of James, I think, believes that there's really an incredible power in how people of faith conduct themselves publicly. And that's one of the reasons why this book is so maybe desperate or urgent at times, is because not just because it sees the stakes as high, but the author also sees the church as having a really important role to play in being a kind of alternate society, or organizing itself by alternate values than the surrounding culture. And so then tonight, finally, right, when we get to the end of the book, we'll get to chapter 5, and James is going to talk about things like corporate prayer and confession and restoration. In other words, James is going to turn the focus Not so much on don't be like them or don't be like those values that you see outside of yourself, but rather how are you going to conduct yourself in a way in which you take care of those within your circle. And that's important to look at. And so it's a reminder, I think, that James sees not only the power that exists in how people of faith conduct themselves publicly, but also how we do it privately, or how we do it in our own settings. What happens when the people of God gather together? How do they express solidarity with one another? How do they also express concern for each other? So I've put up a verse here each week with some kind of a gardening or agricultural image. And this one, it's the prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective. And the kind of prayer that James talks about the most is about prayer for healing or prayer of confession within a worshiping community. So that's what James is about, or what it's been about so far. It's a book that in many ways offers really an assault on religious failure or religious hypocrisy, or religious people who aren't able to live out what they claim to confess. Which again, as a religious person, I don't like reading that because I see myself in it. And I prefer the times when Jesus says, like, my yoke is easy, my burden light, come all to me, who labor and carry heavy burdens, I'll give you rest. But this is a book that's really interested in how the church lives and what kind of a public witness it has. And in that regard, it sounds a lot like Jesus in a lot of the Gospels. It's always fun teaching the Gospels because you get to show people the parts that don't always make it into the church pulpit. We tend to read the passages in church where Jesus says really friendly and welcoming things, but there are a lot of passages in the Gospels, especially Matthew, Mark, and Luke, where Jesus is deeply critical of religious authorities and religious insiders. And so James talks about that. It hammers home this message because it doesn't want the church to settle for counterfeit spirituality. It doesn't want us to settle for counterfeit ways of understanding belonging. So that's all by way of introduction. As you know by now, I've long 15, 20-minute introductions. But that's where we are, I think, as we get to chapter 5. When we were in chapter 4 last week, one of the things that James says is humble yourselves before the Lord, and God will exalt you in James 4:10. It's a message that gets hammered home over and over again, right? Of humility, of a spirit of gentleness. Not just because James glories in people who can get trampled on, but because James, I think, believes that that's where you encounter God, and that God will meet you in those moments of humility and living a kind of countercultural existence. So all that said, here may be the hardest verses in the whole book of James, at least the hardest to hear. James chapter 5 says this. In some ways, this is really picking up where James left off in chapter 4. Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you. Well, there we go. James sounds a lot like prophets in the Old Testament, like certain prophets here. If you've ever read the book of Amos, Amos does this for multiple chapters, right? Amos is sickened by what he sees, I think, as massive wealth inequity in Israel, or actually in Judah, or in Israel, and says things like, God is done going to church. Yeah, speaking for God, Amos says things like, I'm tired of your religious assemblies, right? I'm tired of all the festivals. All of that kind of worship means nothing to me because, according to Amos, God sees all of the inequities that are there. So I think the problem is maybe not so much simple prosperity, but this idea of inequity, that the wealth that's supposed to benefit many ends up becoming a way in which certain people live in luxury while others don't. For James here, there's this interesting image of all of these kind of luxury items or just things that you might want for yourself as failing you. So riches becoming rotted, clothes becoming moth-eaten, precious metals becoming rusted. This idea is that the things that you thought would bring lasting security are going to finally wear out, or they're going to fail you in the end. In other words, the things that you thought were supposed to bring a kind of lasting security or permanent security, they're not going to make it, right? They're going to somehow let you down or wear out. They don't provide the permanence that you think. I think we talked last week about the parable that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 12. It's called the parable of the rich fool. At least that's what it's usually referred to as, about this man who has a farmer who's prosperous, who has this massive yield. And so to handle all of his crop, he tears down his barns and builds bigger ones and stores them. And then says, basically, I'm going to say to my soul, you know, you've stored up all of these good things, eat, drink, and be merry. And then God speaks in the parable, you fool, tonight your life is demanded of you. It's this idea of kind of plotting for a future, imagining that you can control the future or ensure your own security. Again, this is in a world where there were no things like retirement accounts or insurance policies. So not to totally give us an out, but you know, we live in a different economy. We live in a different way of understanding what long-term security can look like. We live in a society, at least most of us probably at Westminster, that's much more built around nuclear families as opposed to extended families. So we can talk about all of that, and I hope we will. But first, James gets to speak, right? You've laid up treasure for the last days. Jesus says as well in the Gospels, wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be as well. So James is not totally out of line in the New Testament. In other words, there are other biblical authors who say similar things. It's also fair to say that in the Roman world, wealth inequality was dramatic. I think as it is in some ways in our society, but there were the people who had kind of leisure wealth were very much a small percentage of society. What we would call a middle class today was relatively non-existent in the ancient world. Most people were, you know, one bad accident or one bad illness, one bad weather event away from suffering deeply, right? Because of there was no real kind of social safety net in the way we think about that in our society. Not to say that our society works for everybody, but I think you get my point. So anyway, James goes on then. So in the middle of the screen here, we see something about the wages of laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud. Here's maybe some specificity in terms of what James is upset about. They're workers who aren't getting paid or being exploited in some way, shape, or form. And so James says their cries have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. That's always bad news, right? The prophets will sometimes talk about the cries of the poor reaching God, or even before the exodus out of Israel, that God hears the cries of the Hebrew people enslaved in Egypt. And so that usually implies in a lot of those prophetic writings, when God hears those cries, that God's about to act. So there's a sense of urgency here as well. So that idea of fattening your hearts in a day of slaughter, it's an odd image there, but might be talking about a coming judgment. You've condemned and murdered the righteous one. People disagree what James is talking about here. Some think this might be a reference to the killing of Jesus. It might just simply mean you condemned and murdered, you know, a righteous person, somebody who doesn't resist you. It just might be simply that James is speaking about the innocent. Maybe that's somebody who's poor, maybe somebody, a laborer who hasn't been paid. This is, I think, where James's criticism of people is loudest. It's also where it's hard to tell, is James talking to the audience, or is James speaking to some absent group of wealthy people and letting the audience of the letter overhear it, if you see what I mean by that. Right, is this James speaking to the broader public and making sure the church can hear it? And so is this maybe the last opportunity for the church to hear just how dangerous this allure toward wealth and power might be? Let me pause there. There might be some questions on where we're at. at this stage of things, or maybe some comments or things that you see in those 6 verses that we want to talk about?
Matt, with your title of old, I don't know if anyone can hear me or not, but with your title of old wisdom, new wisdom, it just struck me, and I don't mean to bring this up, but I am bringing it up. You have murdered the just, and what we've learned about what's going on in the Ukraine, and we probably all want to not just dwell on how that could just drag us down thinking about that. But that phrase just is so current to me. It just hit me right now in reference to what's going on in part of the world, with the theory that the world is the devil's playground. There's that theory. And all we have is our belief in Christ, which is enough if only more would hear of Christ correctly, unlike Putin quoting the Bible out of context or whatever. But so that I'll just throw that out.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that as I was preparing this, or I hadn't thought about images from Ukraine, but right. I mean, and here I said, who knows who the righteous one is in James's view? And I think what you're pointing out, John, is that doesn't matter so much in comparison to who are the righteous ones in our own world, and however you want to define righteous in that regard. But who are the innocent who are being slaughtered in the name of whatever? And yeah, those images are seared in a lot of our minds right now, as are ones closer to home.
Yes.
That we about where we those on this call have probably more complicity in some way, shape, or form. But yeah, I don't want to make that just an abstract question of who is this, the righteous. So, I mean, thanks for that. It's I teach this. I said a little bit about this in the prayer at the beginning. I've been teaching through James, and I think I always want to talk about morally, there's a lot more ambiguity than what James allows. And then, we get off the Zoom call, and before I go to bed, I look at the news and I think the news is quite bleak, so I appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you.
Do you think the reference to the laborers in the field, is that in any way a reference to the toilers in the vineyard? Sort of an example of your thoughts on what people's values are, and all you have to pay them is all they're worth, as opposed to all that you could afford. Do you think that was a tie-in, or is it just an agrarian metaphor that in a subsistence culture would be very common?
I think probably the latter, as opposed to directly tied to the parable. But one of the reasons the parable works is because it's
very approachable.
It was, yeah, that the laborers, well, in any culture, are easily exploited, especially when you think about quote unquote unskilled laborers, right, or somebody working in a vineyard or something like that. And ones who aren't hired until the end of the day. I mean, all the things in terms of the disadvantages that they would have. Yeah. We sometimes, in the United States, we sometimes trumpet Roman law as it was this great paragon of fairness or something like that. And yeah, it really was not. It was great if you were a Roman citizen, but for the most part, it was about keeping powerful protected and the lowly in line. And so that's part of it. I think James sees himself as an advocate for him. Yeah, Dwayne.
Well, you've mentioned that theme of advocating for the poor, or the voices of the laborers who are defrauded. But there's also a mention in that passage of last times or last day, something like that. I'm wondering if there's a motif of judgment or end, and that, the whole business of throwing the straw into the fire and harvesting the wheat and the chaff and all that is somewhere in this language, or a mix. It's like James really comes in between. He's not way out there like Amos, nor totally apocalyptic in terms of eschatology. He seems to be in there close wrestling, cheek and jowl, if you will, with the reality of his community. But I wonder if there isn't a sort of a sway of eschatology, and it come to this in this part of the letter.
I think so. And just if people are wondering, eschatology, there is basically talking about the fulfillment of all things, or the return of Jesus, or a time of judgment, a kind of culmination or reckoning, which is where James is going to go in verse 7 in the next verse. So I think that's also a good sign that that's part of what's being talked about here, is that James is seeing the whatever the real life stuff is of people losing their lives, or people not getting paid who should have been paid, and is viewing that in light of this bigger picture, right? That wealth is going to fail you in the long run, that you're going to be, what's the language, right? That the rust of your gold and silver will be evidence against you. It's this kind of courtroom imagery, this kind of judgment imagery. So I do think that yeah, James, who's been so focused on kind of daily life and daily matters, is now expanding that a little bit. In good old New Testament fashion, right? There's references to judgment in a lot of places in the New Testament. The question is, what do they imagine judgment to look like? So maybe we should move to verse 7 then. Provide a nice segue. So let's go to that. Of course, first I have to back up a little bit before we get to verse 7, as I'm prone to do, coming in the last couple of weeks, right? So much focus on envy and competition especially in chapters 3 and 4. This is part of that friendship with the world that James is so deeply concerned about. The letter is now going to start to move to a close, starting in verse 7, with really a focus on communal care, and talking about a community that's held together by things like perseverance and honesty, which aren't necessarily opposites of envy and competition, but nobody wants to read a letter that just tells you over and over again what not to do. And so this is the part of the letter that actually says, here's something productive you can be concerned about, right? Or what's the power that unites this community, or that expresses its values. So in James 5, then, verse 7, it starts off, be patient, therefore, beloved. So now clearly the address has shifted away from, quote unquote, the wealthy, now toward the church. So it's interesting, when James is advocating for the poor, James doesn't seem to describe himself as among the poor, for example, nor does James seem to describe himself as among the wealthy. You know what I mean? He's kind of this, either he's somewhere in the middle, or just he understands the letter as being a kind of third party who's helping the readers of the letter figure out their own place and how to act towards others. So be patient, therefore, beloved, until the coming of the Lord. So here's language of the return of Jesus, that expression, the coming of the Lord, pretty common in a lot of New Testament writings. It's pretty clear from the New Testament that the earliest believers, the earliest Christians were expecting Jesus to return really at any time. Soon, probably in some cases. We see this in Paul's writings, where Paul seems to be really unconcerned about things like marriage or the rights or the dignity of slaves, and just says basically, we're living at the end of the ages. In the Gospels, Jesus says things that seem to suggest his followers thought he was coming back at any time. There are some other writings that the book of 2 Peter, for example, tries to convince its readers that it's okay that Jesus hasn't returned yet. It says, don't worry, maybe 1,000 years are like a day in the sight of God, that maybe our problem is timing and not Jesus' own trustworthiness. So we see this throughout the New Testament, this conviction that people were living really in the final days. And the encouragement usually in the New Testament is around perseverance. And so when it talks about patience here, I think it's not just patience in the sense of, learn to wait a long time, or learn to wait passively. Like, that's how I was raised. Or, my mother told me to be patient. It was usually stop bugging me, right? But I think it's maybe a different kind of patience than that. Then we get illustrations, right? The farmer waits for the precious crop from the earth, being patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts. Hearts in the ancient world were less about like emotions or the seat of love, the way we tend to think about hearts today, or courage, like we think about it today. It's more the idea of intention. In the ancient world is kind of where your will to act comes from. So it's again that theme of single-mindedness, right? Strengthen your hearts is essentially, remain single-minded, right? Stay focused. Don't just endure, don't just buckle in for a long wait, but be engaged in the struggle, so to speak. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. Again, this idea that of all times, right? Be ready now. Beloved, do not grumble against one another. So now, this idea of grumbling, right? It's starting to look inward as well, right? Don't grumble against one another. Don't get caught up in maybe kind of insider pettiness toward one another. Don't grumble against one another so that you may not be judged. See, the judge is standing at the doors. Again, this idea of urgency or the imminence of a coming judgment. As an example of suffering and patience, now again, this is more be patient, persevere. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Well, what is that supposed to mean? Well, most of the prophets didn't see what they were speaking about, or at least were warning about things yet to come. But also the prophets were largely ignored, as best we can tell, by the people to whom they were speaking. Most of the prophets that we find in the Older Testament are in the halls of power trying to address kings and priests who largely are not interested in what they have to say. So again, it's not just a patience in the sense of be willing to wait a long time, but keep at it. Indeed, we call blessed those who showed endurance. You have heard of the endurance of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. Maybe you hear the expression of people having the patience of Job. That probably comes from the book of James, because if you read Job itself, Job seems a little impatient, right? If you've read Job, Job is contending with God, saying, "I've done nothing wrong," right? Either God has made a mistake here, or God isn't to be trusted, or something's wrong. Job is demanding answers, but he's contending amidst suffering, and so maybe that's a good way of taking this. That again, it's not about passivity, but it's about staying engaged. James goes on in verse 12, above all, my beloved, don't swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but yet your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you may not fall under condemnation. Interesting that this is above all. Like, is this the most important thing in the whole letter? Is this a warning against taking an oath, like in a legal setting or something like that? That's a great question. I think it's because James is now coming back to the notion of the importance of speech. Remember back in chapter 3, where James talks about the tongue and the importance of, or the potential danger that the tongue can do, and all the destruction that's possible through human speech. James is going to now start talking about the ways in which speech can heal, as opposed to how it can be destructive. And the letter is going to close, I think, talking about that. And so it begins with this idea of oath taking. And again, the context here is probably legal settings, but it's probably also within the community, that James is saying, when you're engaged in your own internal conversations, your own internal debates, don't swear oaths, but instead just speak truthfully, right? Get your yes be yes and your no be no, so that you might not fall under condemnation. This echoes something that Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, something similar, where Jesus is speaking here. I say to you, don't swear at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's God's footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. Don't swear by your head, for you can't make one hair white or black. Right? You don't have power over these things. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. There are some Christian groups that I think take this quite seriously and when we refuse to swear oaths, I think, in court. I don't think that's necessarily all that this means. I think that the conversation here is more about within Christian community, that it's about again, truth telling, right? To swear an oath implies you're in a context where you might not be trusted, or you have to somehow provide some kind of assurance for your trust. So in a courtroom, you have to swear an oath because then you're held accountable if you're lying, right? And there's legal penalties if you're found out in a lie. In a community where everybody can trust each other, where you can trust one another's words, there's no need for oaths or for promises. Or not promises, you know what I mean, but kind of ways of, if I'm wrong, then you can, do this. I think James is pleading for a community of honesty in this talk about confessions. More about speech, right? Are any among you suffering? They should pray. Are any cheerful? They should sing songs of praise. This is not advice you give to people like you're suffering. You should pray. It's not like, this is not like treating the wounds of people lightly. So that's the point. But here are ways in which speech can build up, right? If you're suffering, turn to prayer. Let your joy turn into songs of praise. Are any among you sick? They should call for the elders of the church and have them pray over them. That word call can also be translated summon, which I really like. It's more than just asking, right, or calling. It's a sense of, I'm sick, demanding, now that you come. Don't tell the pastoral staff I said that, but there's a sense in which, right, that this is how the community should function, right? That somebody's sickness is everybody's business in a way. They should come and pray over them, anointing them with oil in the name of the Lord. Anointing with oil was a common practice in the ancient world. Sometimes seen as itself being able to cure. Or what I like about it is it involves touch. There's something about that I think that's powerful. You need to be anointed with oil. Somebody has to touch you, right? There's a way in which it implies a kind of either intimacy or a shared belonging that I think is really important, or connection. I don't have to tell some of you this, but nothing alienates a person from community like an illness or like being sick or injured, even in our society, maybe especially in our society where we have, a whole kind of industry for treating people who are ill, and that often involves, taking people out of their homes or out of community and being somewhere. Can do great good, right? But I have stories, and you all have stories. You get sick, you're in the hospital, and friends don't visit you because it's hard to do that. So this is, I think, interesting that James is talking about one of the strengths of this community is to care for those who are ill. The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise them up. And anyone who has committed sins will be forgiven. This is kind of fascinating because we're talking about at least three different things here, I think. We're talking about health and healing from an illness. We also seem to be talking about forgiveness. We're also going to be talking about salvation. So that word save, it's an interesting word. It can just mean rescue. It can be used in the context of healing. When Jesus encounters people and heals them and says things like, your faith has made you well, or your faith has saved you, right? There's multiple meanings of the word in play here in terms of what does it mean to be saved. Also, there's this idea of kind of a spiritual salvation. So the idea of the Lord will raise them up is both resurrection language and it's also healing language at the same time, kind of being lifted up out of your bed, as well as being, raised up in Christ. So if you want to know which is it or how are these connected, my answer is just going to be yes. These are all interwoven, and this happens, I think, in a lot of places in the Bible, that language of forgiveness, language of our physical health or biological health, and language of God's salvation are interrelated, and our desire to want to separate those into different categories might be a kind of foreign way of imposing categories on the Bible there. We can come back to that. Let me keep going here, though. Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. Again, now language of confession and forgiveness is mixed in with language of healing here. I love that confession is a big part of how James is talking about prayer, and that this is also communal, right? Confess your sins to one another. Prayer is communal, right? Prayer is dialogical between a community and God. Of course, there are things we confess alone to God. There's also things we confess together to God. I love the word confess. Even in English, it in some ways mirrors the word in Greek. The word in Greek, if you break it down, quite literally means to speak in one voice. So confession, right? Con, together, and then fess, right? To fess up, to speak the truth, right? Confession is about everybody speaking the truth together, or everybody acknowledging the truth together. So individual confession is acknowledging a truth before God that we know God knows and that we know, but it's also corporate in public. It's one of the reasons I like how, and the Presbyterian, not the only ones who do this, many other groups do, right? How confession of sins is part of a worship service and is very much corporate, but also involves room for silence and introspection and individual confession. If we really had the time and maybe the mutual trust to do confession well, it would last maybe an hour, right? It would involve conversation and back and forth, right? It might involve ways of people airing their own hurts and harms with one another, right? And getting to the point where we can all say in one voice, right? We recognize the harm that's been done, recognize the harm I've committed, we recognize the harm I've suffered from somebody else. That all of that, I think, is part of confession. It's not just naming this is what I've done wrong, but it's also naming the truth about the harm that we suffer from other people, whether in the room or elsewhere. That would be a long worship service and probably would end with a lot of people upset at the end of it. But I think we're trying to embody that when we do confession. So that's just my little plug about confession there. I think that's why confession is such a big deal at the end of this, because it involves a community getting together and speaking in a single voice. The prayer of the righteous is powerful and effective. Now, another Old Testament example, another prophet. Elijah was a human being like us. Well, kind of. A little more spiritual than I am. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth yielded its harvest. What James doesn't mention is that God basically instructed Elijah to do this. And this is told in the book of 1 Kings, chapter 17 and 18, if you're interested. And this was part of a bigger judgment that God, or kind of an attention-getting device that God was unleashing on the people through Elijah. But the point here again is about the power of prayer. So again, prayer is verbal, prayer uses words. I think in the ancient world, they understood prayer to be something out loud. It involves confession, it involves healing, it involves praise. Last two verses. My brothers and sisters, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and is brought back by another, you should know that whoever brings back a sinner from wandering will save the sinner's soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. And that's where the book ends. There's no, goodbye or, greet these people for me or good night and good luck, nothing like that. But the final statement here is about, I think, our responsibility to one another. You could interpret this as a judgmental church going and hunting people down and telling them what they've done wrong. Don't think you necessarily want to do that. I was teaching a class at Luther Seminary. This is about 10, 15 years ago. And we were talking about a different part of the New Testament that talks about this, a kind of communal accountability. And I had two students in the course from Africa who were talking to me about the best way in which the elders from their church should confront people who haven't come to church on a given Sunday morning. And this was great fun because, of course, all my domestic students, all my American students had these looks of horror on their face as these students started talking about how after church on Sunday morning, the elders in the church would basically go door to door and would find the members of the church who hadn't shown up that morning and would confront them and tell them they had to be there the next Sunday. Which is not just an African thing, by the way. That's the Puritans did similar things, and our Presbyterian forebears did. We just send emails if people haven't shown up after a couple of weeks. No, my point here is not to commend a certain practice, but it's to say that this is this idea of mutual belonging is there in the New Testament. It's there in James, understanding the power of the church to be united. This has, of course, been done in really harmful ways in some communities. I'm not commending those, but it's an interesting way of thinking about how do we care for each other and how do we look out for each other and be accountable to one another as well. So that's how James ends. James wants this community, the author wants this community or whoever's reading it to survive, not just through avoiding things that James thinks are dangerous, but also I think through embracing a kind of ethic or a kind of ethos of communal care and communal health and communal honesty, which admittedly, James doesn't spend a ton of verses talking about it, but those are the last words of the letter, which I think are really powerful and speak to what we've been talking about at Westminster, I think, throughout this year, talking about belonging and what that looks like and just honesty and truth telling in a community as well. So that's kind of the end of my sermon, I guess. Which, let me just say this, it requires humility, I think, as well, to let other people pray for you, to let other people minister to you, to other people speak to God on your account. How that happens through prayer, you know, from the perspective of a Sunday morning church service, there's always how do you stage this, or how do you do this in a way that's authentic and doesn't create a worship service that lasts for 4 hours or becomes totally unruly. But it should model, I think, a kind of vulnerability that we all partake in, not just the person from the pulpit who's been responsible to compose a prayer. So what do we think? Especially about those final verses there and how the book ends and the kind of vision of community it puts forward. Anything catch your attention or raise questions for you?
Matt, the term redactor, would that be someone who put things together? Because to me, James, so many different thoughts that I'm not convinced that one author wrote this, because it seems so he's here and he's there and he's here, that it was put together and then given authority by saying that James, the brother of Jesus, or whoever wrote it. Is there some credence in that? Not that I don't respect the letter and the wisdom and the truth. It's just the way he jumps around to different things, particularly near the end of the letter.
Sure. Yeah, if it is redacted or just edited, it's another kind of way of putting that. I suppose that's a possibility. It does have that character of just being a kind of grab bag of topics that almost sounds like here are, like the way we use aphorisms, you know, like if you read the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, that just sounds like a string of aphorisms, right? And then sometimes you see some groupings where similar aphorisms are together. It's possible that parts of James were maybe segments of like early Christian sermons or early Christian teachings. And we know this because there's other kinds of Greek literature, or we know this is possible because there are other kinds of Greek literature that are basically little snippets of ethical advice. And so it's possible that James is kind of a greatest hits of Christian teaching that maybe an author collected and put together. I don't think that doesn't necessarily mean that the book doesn't have an integrity of its own. Let me state that positively. The book still seems to have a kind of integrity of its own.
Yes.
In terms of the kinds of themes it's interested in, but I will admit it does have certainly an abrupt ending, and it does sometimes jump from point to point in ways that are jarring. That you compare that to something like some of Paul's writings, where he clearly is, well, clearly, maybe not clearly, where Paul seems to be following an argument and he knows where he's going with it. Doesn't mean he won't occasionally veer off into some tangents.
And as far as endings, the way the Gospel of Mark ends so abruptly, also.
Yeah, you know, some endings in the Bible for sure. I mean, I think that even maybe, you know, some of the collections of Jesus' teachings in the Gospels are probably collections of accumulated memories about Jesus, as opposed to somebody took notes and this is what he said on that Thursday verbatim. That doesn't reduce the importance of it or the value of it or respect for it. It just says it's speculation on why it might be kind of haphazard's not right, sudden, jarring, disjointed at times.
Yes, Jesus did not teach in a university setting like Luther, who had students that took notes that became
Something like that. If you sat in one of my lectures and talk about tangents and dead ends, but yeah. And students pick up on that. They can tell like what professors like tangents, and they know how to throw you off your trail. Yeah, Margaret.
So I was just thinking, as we were talking about this, there's an intimacy in the end of this of his speech that I think is very he's somebody who speaks with these kind of hard statements of expectation or how things ought to be, and yet in this last chapter, there's some it sounds to me like there's just some intimacy about, and some what am I trying to say? Not kindness really, but concern. And he's talking to people that he cares about, even though he sometimes uses harsh words. And I guess I just heard that more in this chapter 5 than I'd heard previously. And I find it very moving in some ways.
Yeah. I think so. It would certainly be a different book if there weren't these final dozen verses or something like that.
Right. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say, I think.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that a lot. And I think it's, like I said too, it's nice to hear, instead of don't do these things, here's what you can actually do now to create a healthy community.
Well, he sounds like an exacting person who has definite ideas and beliefs, and he's trying to use them for other people's good, and for the good of the gospel. But in these last verses, it feels like there's just this, it softens somewhat.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Ken, I see your hand.
Yeah. Matt, you started in week 1 talking about who the audience for the letter, who he was speaking to, and the tribes. At the end here, he's saying brothers and sisters, which I'd like to believe is very inclusive of all genders. Is he also speaking in mixed company with people who are both oppressed or suffering and those that are privileged? How, I'm just trying to imagine if this were being delivered to a room of people, what would the room of people look like? Would it be all inclusive? And part of me says if they'd had some of the privileged people there, he probably wouldn't have gotten to the end of the end of the letter. They would have taken him and probably rebelled. But it seems like inclusive language at the end to speak to both brothers and sisters. And was just wondering if you could say a few more words about audience.
Well, I hate to burst your bubble, but it does end with, the Greek is just brothers.
Oh, okay.
Translated, at least in this version, in the NRSV, as brothers and sisters, because clearly it's not addressed just to men, at least in concept, but that's just a nod to a more inclusive English reading so that we don't.
I see. So I've given him too much credit.
In the ancient world, people would have heard brothers as mostly addressed to everybody, just like in the 1950s, if I talked about mankind and 1950s, 1980s, or just, if I used men as a synonym for human beings.
Or guys, we used.
I still use that all the time growing up in California. Yeah, guys and dudes is always. So in my head, it's not gendered, but I'm trying to fix that in my own mind. But yeah, so that's not to say that everybody heard it as inclusive, but I think the usage was different. So yeah, that's nevertheless, the question of who the audience was, I think everybody, I think all of our guesses is as good as mine in this regard. It seems to be a group that's not necessarily quote unquote poor. I mean, it's not, that's not a feature of everybody in the group, nor do they appear to be super wealthy. And James seems to be worried about how they're going to treat both of those groups in some way, shape, or form. They're under some kind of trial, they're under some kind of testing. That just might be that they're suffering a kind of exclusion culturally. Maybe they're just viewed as weird by their neighbors. That's possible.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no evidence that, for example, they've been expelled from a synagogue, I don't think. I don't think there's any example that they're suffering physical violence. But you can suffer a lot of oppression without physical violence. I mean, you can. So there might be lost friendships, there might be lost business opportunities, and kind of the financial stress of that. They could be perceived as dangerous in a community because they're not worshiping the right deities, and that's going to be bad for the crops this year. I mean, those types of things are certainly possible for Christians and for Jews in the first century. This is all kind of a reverse reading. You read it and you try to think, I wonder if the audience is this, and then you read it again and see if that hypothesis fits. And it strikes me as a community that's really, it's asking the question, should we try to fit in a little bit more? If we adjust our values to fit in with the surrounding values and try to be more respectable, maybe people will leave us alone, or maybe we'll stop getting all the nasty looks in the marketplace, and maybe it'll be easier for us. And James seems to be saying, I think, stay weird. Whether or not that's good advice is a question we can't fully answer because we weren't there. But how we take that advice for ourselves, I think, is something that we all have to talk about. Does that help? I mean,
Yeah, it does.
That's at least my imagination. It's an audience that was obviously, it's big enough that some people get sick and some people are healthy. And I think he's writing to more than a dozen people. If that helps.
Matt, is it too mystical or Holy Spirit oriented to say that we are the audience tonight? We are the audience.
Oh, that's not. There's nothing wrong with that. That's yeah. No, this is what happens when you get a biblical scholar who always wants to live in the first century. So I need you to keep pulling me out of the first century into the 21st. So absolutely, I think we read over the shoulders of ancient audiences, and that's my way of putting it, that we're liable to do a lot of violence to the text, or just wrench it into whatever we want to say, if we don't take care to at least acknowledge where it came from and why it might speak in certain ways. And that helps us maybe be critical of some parts of it, also helps us see ways in which it might sound odd to our ears. But yeah, how the book addresses us across the centuries is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And that's not just through how did a first century audience read it, it's also through how has this book been used over the last 2,000 years in ways that have been, I think, helpful and harmful, and being aware of that as well.
Yes.
So, we're at 8:00. Is there anybody, I'm just looking to see if anybody else is dying to get.
This is Carol Ann. I just, this last question, and your response just kind of brings me full circle to, perhaps it would be beneficial to remind us why you chose this for us to study together at this particular time.
That's a good question. Well, I wanted something that would fit in Lent, and I wanted something that would kind of match Lenten themes about kind of introspection and kind of self-examination. And James seemed like a book that was the right size to me. And I really like that James is, I think I mentioned this one in the first or the second week or both, that it's a book that ultimately isn't about theological abstractions or big theological ideas, but it's more about activity and action. And I think it's just helpful every now and then for Westminster, which is a church that does like to reflect on things and live in our heads. I know I certainly do. So I thought it would be an interesting challenge because it'd be a different enough book, but also a book that speaks to that whole question of values and how do you live out Christian values in the world. I often describe Westminster to other people, to friends, that it's a church that has a tremendous amount of resources. I don't mean just financial or real estate, but just in terms of the energy in a community like Westminster for change and for doing good. And I want to be part of thinking about kind of the reasons why we do those things. So that it's not just a kind of a reflex action on Westminster's part, but that it's deeply rooted in an understanding of what are our own values. And again, James doesn't spend a lot of time dwelling on big Christian values. It hardly talks about Jesus. But I think the book drives us to consider, well, what are the values that we resort to? I think Westminster does a pretty good job at those things, but I like talking about them. I like creating space for the people of Westminster to talk about them, and our guests. Not everybody here is a kind of a formal member of the Westminster community, and that's great as well. But so that was part of it. You know, I'm not a big Lent person. Lent. I don't need regular reminders that my life is
Finite.
it's finite, and that human beings are vulnerable in many ways. I feel that on a regular basis. But I like the opportunity that Lent provides to just slow down a bit and kind of ask, why are we doing things this way, or what are our motives for this? And this seemed a good book to do that. There's no big hidden agenda or anything like that, but that's part of it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great question. I'm sure we could spend another hour talking about, why I thought it was a good book. So I'm doing John after Easter. I'm doing that because John's got great stories, and Easter, abundant life, it's kind of a different look of James. It's much more, it's less about the sternness of James isn't quite there in the same way. We'll have there'll be more smiles, I think, during the Gospel of John. Well, I think I'm going to I'll quickly put on the screen what the discussion questions are, and that's just for people who are watching the video, because they've told me they like to see the questions, so they can pause the video and see those. And if folks are logging off,
You just want question 1 and 2?
bye.